Prince Edward just pulled off something almost no one saw coming. And strangely, the most fascinating part is not what he may have secured. It is how he did it. Because for years, King Charles appears to have operated under one very powerful assumption, a dangerous one if true, the assumption that once he became king, he would have the final say over the family structure, over royal property, over titles, over the assets and symbols connected to them. In other words, that the crown, through him, could reorganize the monarchy from the top down. But on March 25, 2026, that assumption reportedly ran into something cold, hard, and extremely inconvenient. Paper. Signed paper. And according to this account, it told him something he did not expect to hear. That he could not do what he thought he could do. That is what makes this story so compelling. Prince Edward did not just win an internal dispute. If these reports are accurate, he exposed a deeper problem at the very top of the monarchy. A misunderstanding about what a king can and cannot actually control once legal commitments, private gifts, and documented agreements are already in place. And he did it in the most Edward way possible. Quietly, carefully, without drama in public, without press warfare, without emotional scenes on camera. He did it by being the one person in the family who, it seems, kept every receipt. And once you understand that, the story changes completely, because this was never just about one title, it was never just about one estate, it was never just about one piece of jewelry. It was about power. Real power. The kind that survives even when the crown itself changes hands. And to understand how this became such a serious rupture, you have to go back to Queen Elizabeth II and the decisions she reportedly made before her death in September 2022. Those decisions were not casual. They were not sentimental gestures made in passing. They appear to have been highly deliberate. Elizabeth had watched the family evolve. She had watched pressure build around money, titles, status, and control. She had seen the monarchy pass through scandal, restructuring, modern media pressure, and private rivalry. And by all accounts, she understood perfectly well that once she was gone, old balances inside the family might not hold. So she appears to have locked certain things down before that could happen. One of them was the Duke of Edinburgh title. That title was meant for Prince Edward. Not eventually, maybe. Not depending on palace mood. Not if convenient. Meant for him. That mattered, because the title had defined Prince Philip for more than 70 years. It was not a decorative label. It was bound up with duty, identity, and legacy. And Elizabeth reportedly wanted it passed to the son who had stayed steady, stayed loyal, stayed largely out of scandal, and never brought the monarchy public damage. That promise was fulfilled in April 2023, when King Charles III formally granted Prince Edward the title Duke of Edinburgh. And if the story had ended there, everything would have looked simple. But it did not end there. Because the title, according to this version of events, was only half of what truly mattered. The other half was Bagshot Park. And that is where the story stops being ceremonial and starts becoming serious. Bagshot Park is not just a large royal house. It is a 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion set on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park. It is the seat associated with the Duke of Edinburgh title. In practical terms, it gives the title weight, location, and presence. Without it, the title still exists, but it becomes thinner, less grounded, more symbolic than substantial. And according to reports, Queen Elizabeth had made clear in writing that the estate and the title were meant to remain tied together. If true, that detail changes everything. Because it meant Edward was not simply receiving a name, he was receiving a role with a base, a title with a home, a legacy with physical substance. There are claims that in her final years, Elizabeth signed a letter of intent tying Bagshot Park directly to the Edinburgh title, and that Prince Philip witnessed it in the final stage of his life. Whether every detail of that account can be independently verified or not, The claim itself is central to why this entire dispute became explosive. Because if that document existed, the message was unmistakable. The title and the estate were meant to stay together. But after Elizabeth was gone, a different mindset appears to have taken hold inside palace circles. A harsher one, a more centralizing one. A view that modernization meant rationalization, cost-cutting, review, control, the right to revisit old arrangements, the right to tighten loose ends, and perhaps, where useful, the right to pull things back under the core authority of the crown. By 2026, that mindset had reportedly moved beyond quiet theory. There were reviews of royal leases, financial audits, internal pressure over how members of the family lived and what they controlled, and in that atmosphere, Bagshot Park reportedly became a target. This is where the story turns ugly. Because Edward did not simply receive Bagshot Park in perfect condition as a comfortable royal reward. When the estate was first offered to him, it was in poor shape, worn down, outdated, neglected. There had reportedly even been serious consideration of taking it out of royal residential use altogether and converting it into something commercial, like a hotel or conference venue. That is how little value some parts of the system seemed to have seen in it at the time. Instead, Edward took it on. And he did not just occupy it. He invested in it. He restored it. He carried the burden attached to it. The lease signed in March 1998 reportedly gave him the estate at a low rent, but that came with a major condition. He had to fix it. Not someday, not gradually, properly. The estate needed immediate work, and by reported figures, Edward put in substantial private money of his own. The total cost of repairs reportedly climbed into the millions. The Crown estate covered part of it, but Edward carried a serious share himself. That matters. Because once the work was done, the arrangement changed. The rent rose. The National Audit Office was said to have recognized the new market value. In other words, this was not free comfort floating in royal privilege. This was a documented financial relationship involving real expense, real upkeep, and real investment. And that makes the later pressure look very different. Because once someone has spent years paying, restoring, maintaining, and legally securing a property, trying to detach them from it no longer looks like administrative tidying. It looks like an attempted rollback. And Edward, by all appearances, saw that clearly. He reportedly went further in 2007 by extending the lease to 150 years through his company, Eclipse Nominees Limited. If true, that was not passive occupancy. That was long-term legal positioning. It meant control. It meant planning. It meant he was not simply living inside an arrangement, he was reinforcing it. And by the mid-2020s, the value of Bagshot Park had reportedly soared. That creates another uncomfortable question. If the estate could somehow be pulled back, who would benefit? Because now the numbers were no longer small. The property was no longer a tired liability. It had become a major asset. And once assets become valuable, motives are always read differently. That is exactly why Prince Philip's role in this story becomes impossible to ignore. If he truly witnessed documentation meant to protect Edward's connection to the estate, then he was doing more than observing. He was anticipating. He had spent decades inside the monarchy. He understood better than almost anyone how quietly institutions can move once they decide someone's position needs to be reduced, contained, or rearranged. And if he believed his youngest son might one day need protection, then backing that protection in writing was not sentiment. It was strategy. So by the time March 25, 2026 arrived, Edward was not walking into this unprepared. He reportedly had a legal file built around 3 points. First, the original lease and the evidence of his financial investment. Second, the Queen's letter tying Bagshot Park to the Dukedom. Third, years of records showing he had maintained the estate at a level that preserved value and saved the wider institution from cost and embarrassment. That is not a complaint. That is a defense structure. And yet, even with all that, the situation remained dangerous. Because Charles still controlled the system. Not necessarily the law in Edward's favor, if the reports are true, but the atmosphere, the machinery, the internal pressure points, the structure that can make royal life difficult without ever having to announce war in public. So the dispute was never just legal. It was political. It was personal. And then, according to the story, it became even more personal. Because earlier in 2026, before the legal dossier fully came into play, another move reportedly took place. Quiet, polite, bureaucratic, the kind of move that can sound harmless while carrying a very sharp edge. A palace official arrived for what was described as a jewelry audit. A routine heritage review. A simple check. That was the language. But the deeper meaning, according to the narrative, was obvious. Nothing was off limits. And at the center of this review was one item in particular, the Anthem Tiara. That is where the emotional temperature of this story rises sharply. Because this was not just another jewel in a vault. It was reportedly created specifically for Sophie's wedding in 1999, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II herself, using antique elements linked to Queen Victoria's collection. For years, it was effectively Sophie's defining tiara, the piece most associated with her public image. That matters because Sophie was never widely seen as having open, effortless access to the grandest state tiaras in the way some other senior royal women did. Whether spoken openly or not, there was always a visible hierarchy. Sophie occupied a respected place, but not the center. The Anthem Tiara was not just jewelry, it was identity, continuity, recognition. So when arguments reportedly emerged that it could be classified as crown property because of its historical materials, the implications went far beyond storage policy. The message was this. What had felt personal could be reclassified as institutional. What had been worn as one's own could become something borrowed by permission. What had looked like security could be reduced to temporary access. And if that principle held for one tiara, then where would it stop? That is the dangerous logic here. Because once private gifts from a monarch can be revisited after the fact, the entire royal family enters unstable ground. Other gifts, other jewels, other personal inheritances, other quiet understandings, all suddenly vulnerable to review. And as Edward's legal team reportedly realized that logic would not stop with Sophie, it could eventually circle back toward everyone, including those trying to apply it. The story grows even darker because of the memory it evokes. There had long been public sensitivity around jewelry connected to Princess Diana. So any suggestion that historically significant personal pieces could be reclaimed, repurposed, or reinterpreted through institutional power was always likely to ignite emotion. This time, according to the account, Edward did not stay quiet. His lawyers reportedly answered with a deed of gift signed by Queen Elizabeth in 1999, stating that the Anthem Tiara was a private wedding present to Sophie, not a state loan, not a trust-held item, not a temporary ceremonial asset. A private gift. That distinction, if documented as claimed, would shut down the argument at its root. And there was more. Elizabeth had also personally honored Sophie with the Royal Victorian Order, a distinction given for direct service to the monarch. Taken together, the symbolism is striking. The Queen honored her personally, gifted her personally, and then, according to the story, legally confirmed the personal nature of that gift. That is not vague affection. That is recorded intent. But Edward, it seems, had gone even further. There are claims that back in 1999 he had worked with royal jewelers on a matching black and white pearl set for Sophie, designed specifically to complement the Anthem Tiara. And according to this narrative, while Crown Resources may have funded materials, Edward held design rights. That introduced another layer of protection. His legal team could then argue that the tiara and the matching pearls formed a unified artistic ensemble, and that removing one piece would interfere with the integrity of the whole. Whether or not every technical detail of that argument would survive outside a courtroom is almost secondary to the point. Edward's side was not improvising. It was building layers. And behind all of this sat something more intimate than law. Sophie wore that tiara on her wedding day. Years later, in a public moment that drew attention precisely because it felt genuine, she referred to Queen Elizabeth as Mama. It slipped out naturally, and that one word told people far more than rehearsed royal language ever could. It suggested trust, affection, near-filial attachment. So when the tiara came under scrutiny, this was not just an asset dispute. It felt, to those involved, like someone reaching into a personal bond after the person at the center of that bond was gone. By the afternoon of March 25, 2026, the pressure appears to have reached a breaking point. Edward's legal team reportedly delivered a warning. If the claim over the tiara was not dropped, private letters from Queen Elizabeth could be released showing her clear wish that Sophie retain full ownership of her personal jewelry. And according to the story, those letters may have included candid language about Camilla. If so, that threat was not merely legal, it was reputational dynamite. Because Charles had spent years overseeing the long, difficult rehabilitation of Camilla's public image, anything that appeared to reopen Elizabeth's colder private feelings toward her could undo years of careful stabilizing work. At that point, the issue was no longer a tiara. It was control, image, legacy. And by evening, according to reports, the Anthem Tiara remained with Sophie. But Edward then took another step. He had it placed under direct private security beyond the reach of any quiet reclassification process. That move matters symbolically. It says trust was gone. The legal letters had been sent. The warning had been delivered. And now the family itself was no longer enough. Protection had become external, deliberate, and formal. But even then, the story was not over. Because next came the one person who could change the balance without raising her voice. Princess Anne. When Anne reportedly entered the situation, everything changed. There was no theatricality to it. No need. Anne carries something few others in that family can command: credibility without performance. She does not waste words, she does not fake warmth, and she does not intervene lightly. That is what made her role so serious. According to the account, she told Charles something blunt enough to stop the room cold. If their mother's signature on a lease or deed of gift could be treated as negotiable after her death, then the authority of a monarch's word would begin to collapse. And if that collapse began under Charles, it would not stop with the past. It would eventually weaken his own signature too. That is not sibling irritation. That is a warning about constitutional trust. Anne reportedly understood Bagshot Park and the tiara as one fight, not two. In both cases, Queen Elizabeth had personally given something and supported it with signed documentation. In both cases, those decisions were now allegedly being challenged through institutional reinterpretation. And Anne's point was simple: if one can be taken back, then the other can too. And once that principle is accepted, nothing the late Queen settled is truly safe. There was also a human layer Anne would have understood sharply. Sophie lost her own mother young. Over time, Queen Elizabeth appears to have become the closest thing she had to that role. Anne, who had lost both Philip and Elizabeth in quick succession, would have understood the emotional force of objects and decisions left behind by the dead. She would have seen immediately that this was not only paperwork, it was inheritance in the deepest personal sense. And then, according to reports, Anne raised the stakes even further. If pressure from Camilla's office continued, she would respond publicly, not privately, by pushing for a wider audit of the Queen's household operation itself. That threat landed because Anne is one of the few figures in the family whose discipline gives such a threat weight. If she says she will look into allocations, staffing, or spending, people believe she means it. She also reportedly intervened over pressure involving Edward's children, James and Lady Louise, making clear that decisions about their future status were not for palace maneuvering to dictate. By the time that meeting ended, if this account is accurate, the situation had changed completely. Charles now faced two bad options: back the pressure and risk undermining the credibility of his mother's signed decisions, or step back and admit that some lines cannot be crossed, even by a king. And then came the part that may have hit hardest of all. After reviewing the legal file, Charles's own side reportedly concluded that Edward's position was extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, to break. The lease stood, the investment stood, the private gift claims stood, the supporting documents stood. No sweeping royal order could simply erase them. That is a devastating realization for someone who believed the crown granted broad practical control, because it means a king may have status without total reach. It means succession does not automatically rewrite prior commitments. It means family arrangements, once formalized and protected, may outlive the assumptions of the next reign. And yet, according to reports, pressure still did not disappear immediately. Camilla's view was said to be that rules should apply across the family, private gifts and properties included, and that everything should be brought under a tighter central structure. But that was precisely the problem. Edward and Sophie had already built a degree of independence. They had their home, they had their paperwork, they had their own position. They were not entirely dependent on palace discretion, and that made them harder to control. What happened next, according to insiders, was equally dangerous. The palace began to divide internally. Staff took sides. Sympathy reportedly grew around the Edinburgh household. Resentment toward the Queen's office spread in quieter circles, and once sides exist, leaks become more likely. That is when institutions become vulnerable. Not because of shouting, but because trust breaks. One insider reportedly described the king as being led into a minefield, forced to choose between his wife's demands and his mother's final decisions. If true, that is the heart of the tragedy here. There may have been no outcome available that did not damage the family. And beyond the palace walls, the optics were even worse. In a period when the public is already sensitive to money, privilege, and fairness, the image of a king appearing to pressure a brother over a home that brother paid to restore would have been a deeply uncomfortable one. Eventually, according to the story, Charles tried to move outside the legal machinery and back into the personal realm. A handwritten private note reportedly went to Bagshot Park asking for a family meeting. The response was revealing. Edward would not meet without his full legal team present. That is the moment, perhaps more than any other, when the emotional truth of the story becomes unmistakable. Because at that point, this was no longer brother to brother. This was party to party, claim to claim, risk to risk. Edward was no longer acting like the quiet younger son trying to preserve peace. He was acting like someone who understood exactly what could be lost if he relaxed for even a moment. And once that line is crossed, relationships do not simply return to what they were before. Late on March 25, 2026, the palace was reportedly forced to formalize the retreat. A note from the office of the Master of the Jewel House is said to have confirmed that the Anthem Tiara would remain under Sophie's exclusive private control. At the same time, the review of Bagshot Park was quietly closed down. The language may have been dry, bureaucratic, minimal. But the meaning was enormous. The challenge had failed. The crown had stepped back. And everything Edward held remained where Queen Elizabeth had placed it. The title, the estate, the tiara, all of it. That changed the balance inside the family because what had started as a dispute became a record, something written, something archived, something future generations could one day read and understand in a very stark way. A claim was made, resistance was organized, and the institution had to withdraw. But victory did not mean peace. That may be the saddest part of the story. Because even if the legal outcome held, trust almost certainly did not. The relationship between Charles and Edward, if this account reflects reality, could not emerge unchanged. Public duty may continue. Appearances may remain smooth. Photographs may still show order, ceremony, and brotherhood. But families know when something has broken. And this kind of break does not vanish. It hardens. It becomes formal. It becomes careful. It becomes the kind of silence that speaks every time two people stand next to each other and both know exactly what had to be done behind the scenes. There is also a larger institutional shift buried inside all this. It suggests two centers of gravity inside the modern monarchy. On one side, Charles and Camilla pressing toward a more centralized, controlled, streamlined model. On the other, figures like Anne, Edward, and Sophie, reportedly supported more quietly by William and Catherine, holding the line around older commitments, private protections, and the final intentions of Elizabeth. If that divide is real, then it matters far beyond one estate or one jewel. It shapes succession culture. It shapes trust. It shapes how future generations will protect themselves. James one day may inherit the Duke of Edinburgh title. If he does, he will inherit it with a very different understanding than earlier generations had. Not simply that titles carry honor, but that institutions can one day revisit what they once gave. And that lesson does not create innocence. It creates caution. As for Charles, he still has the throne. He still has the machinery of monarchy. He still has the public authority of the sovereign. But according to this story, there is something he may no longer have in full. His brother's trust. And that matters because trust is the one royal asset no title can restore once lost. In the end, this may be the true meaning of what happened. Not that Edward outshouted the system. He did not. Not that he outmaneuvered it in public. He did not. He simply prepared better. He kept the documents. He understood the stakes. And when the pressure finally came, he was ready for it. Charles had the crown. Edward had the proof. And when power collides with proof, it is not always the crown that wins.